Hi, welcome to lesson 1.2. In today's lesson, we are going to learn about values and viewpoints. What are some shared values and ways of life that the Mi'kmaq, the Anishinabe, and the Haudenosaunee had in common? So, stick around and let's learn something. Lesson 1.2, we are going to be taking a look at the shared values and the ways of life of the Mi'kmaq, the Anishinabe, and the Haudenosaunee. What were those shared values and how did it kind of come about? So we're going to start with values and viewpoints. And we always talk about diversity in Canada, and that Canada is a very diverse country because it is a diverse country. But the First Nations are also very diverse in their existence. And the First Nations, they don't just live on the East Coast, they don't just live on the West Coast, and they're not just in and around the Edmonton area. They are all over North America. And the First Nations that we are learning about this year in grade 7 are the First Nations of Canada, but there's also First Nations that are now within the borders of the United States. And then next year in grade 8, we learn about the First Nations that make up now today Central America. But the ones that we're focusing on today are the ones here in North America, specifically those that fall within modern day Canada. And First Nations, they live in the Arctic, in the mountains, the islands of both the west and the east coast. They're in the grasslands, so here on the prairies, and they are in the tundra. And if you've ever traveled anywhere in Canada, you know that this is a large piece of land. And because of that, it's a large piece of land with today's modern technology too. But even back when, in this point in history, when we are learning about our First Nations, it is such a vast land that it's only natural that each group is going to develop their own very unique culture based on those natural surroundings that they find around them. So if you're in the mountains, then obviously your culture is going to be developed different than those that are going to be on the coast, or even those that are going to be in one of our islands. Which brings us to world views. Worldview, we discuss this one topic in depth next year in grade 8 social studies. But worldviews is the way in which one sees the world, and it's the way in which a group of individuals sees the world. And I've got a picture here of Turtle Island, and many of our First Nations refer to Turtle Island as being North America. And you can see the picture here how North America falls within the turtle. And even though the First Nations, in the previous slide, we learned that the First Nations were a diverse group of people, they also shared some core values. So the many core values emerged, ideas or beliefs about life, and they shared a common creator. Obviously, they shared the natural world, as well as they developed core values about relationships with other people. And they shared 4 main core values with each other. They shared that all people, are one with nature. You cannot separate the two. Another core value number 2, is that the experience and wisdoms of elders is highly valued, and they are to be respected, and they are put on a pedestal, and they are very well respected, and you go to an elder for advice and for guidance. Core value number 3 is the existence of a spiritual world. So we know that a core value, that they have a common creator, and each group has a creation story that exists amongst them, and this existence of that spiritual world. And the 4th core value that our First Nations share is that living with nature, you live in harmony and balance with nature and with each other. We often refer to our First Nations as Indigenous peoples, and that just means that they are the original people of the land. So they are the first ones here. They've always been here. And Indigenous beliefs are passed by traditional teaching. So this goes from generation to generation to generation. It gets passed down from the elders down to the children, and those children, when they become older and they become elders themselves, they pass those stories and those beliefs down to the next generation, and so on and so forth. And the traditional teachings that exist for our Indigenous people, this explains the relationship between everything. So between the plants and animals, the land, the people, the spirit world, everything in between, it's all interconnected. We saw this in the previous slide. It's all about living in harmony. And this is no different whether you are First Nations on the East Coast, which we will be learning about later on in this chapter, or you're here on the plains in and around the Edmonton area, or you're on Vancouver Island, or even to the north in the Arctic region. This traditional teaching generation to generation is a common theme amongst our First Nations people. I want to take a look now at a creation story that comes to us from the Mi'kmaq. And this is just a story. This is going to be an example of traditional teaching. It gets passed down from generation to generation. And all of our First Nations that we learn, they all have their own creation story. This one is from the Mi'kmaq of Eastern Canada. On the other side of the path of the spirits, in ancient times, Kisulk, the creator, made a decision. Kisulk created the firstborn, Niskam, the sun, to be brought across the Milky Way to light the earth. Also sent across the sky was a bolt of lightning that created Sitkamik, the earth. And from that same bolt, Kolskup was also created out of the dry earth. Kolskup became a powerful teacher whose gifts and allies were great. In another bolt of lightning came the light of fire, and with it came the animals, the vegetation, and the birds. Those other life forms gradually gave Kolskup a human form. Kolskup rose from the earth and gave thanks to Kisulk as he honored the 6 directions: the sun, the earth, and then the east, south, west, and north. The abilities within the human form made up the 7th direction. Kolskup asked Kisulk how he should live, and Kisulk in response sent Nakumi, Kolskup's grandmother, to guide him in life. Created from a rock that was transformed into the body of an old woman through the power of Niskam, the sun, Nakumi was an elder whose knowledge and wisdom were enfolded in the Mi'kmaq language. This is one example of one of our Indigenous creation stories. And when we say Indigenous, we don't just mean that Indigenous people live within Canada. Indigenous people are all over the world, on every single continent: North America, Africa, Europe, Asia, Oceania. You will find Indigenous people everywhere except for in Antarctica. Okay, there's no Indigenous that live there. But Indigenous people are absolutely everywhere. And on the graphic here on this slide, you can see that we've got a percentage of the population of the Indigenous people here in the Americas. So if you look over to Canada, we see that 4.9% of our population is First Nations, is Indigenous, 1.7 million people. Okay, this was last reported in 2019. So these are very recent stats. So when we say Indigenous, right now we're talking about those living within Canada, but Indigenous are all over the world. We mentioned elders earlier, and the elders are keepers of knowledge, and their traditions and their stories were passed down using traditional teaching, which was done orally. These elders, we saw at the beginning of this lesson, are the most respected members of their community. And their guidance, their wisdom Their knowledge helps to guide and make good decisions and to teach others using stories. So this is how they shared their language. This is how they would share various ceremonies that would take place, any laws and traditions and skills, and of course, one of the most important things, in addition to their language, which I mentioned already, but their history of who they are as a people. Not only did the stories provide them with knowledge and knowledge for future generations, it also provided them with entertainment. Traditionally, obviously, TVs didn't exist. Your PlayStations and Xboxes, Switches, and things like that didn't exist. There was no phones, there was no electricity, and no internet. So this was their entertainment. They would sit and they would learn, and they would take that knowledge, turn them into stories, and everybody loves a story, turns into entertainment. But as knowledge was being passed down orally, okay, the younger generation is sitting there, and they're sitting there in awe because an elder is a fantastic storyteller. And as they're learning this history in this story, they're collecting this and they're listening to this. And the young people will then repeat these stories to each other. And they would repeat them so often that they would memorize these stories, and these stories would stick with them through this repetition. And they would repeat the stories. If they're going out on hunting expeditions in the evening, then they would sit around and they would tell these stories, and they would repeat these stories, and they would know these stories by heart. Some groups also used a wampum belt, and a wampum belt is a visual reminder. So you can see in the picture here, we have a wampum belt. Each bead represents a different part of that story to help with that memorization of that story so it doesn't get lost. Now, this is different from the Europeans, who had a written record of their stories, and they kept written records, and they brought these records with them, and once they arrived in the Americas, then they wrote everything down. This was something different than what our First Nations were doing. So 2 different ways of recording history and remembering history and keeping stories. We're going to finish off with what's in a name. Names are extremely important, and I always tell my students that people should know how to pronounce your name and say your name. Obviously, at first they won't be able to get it. My name, Philiplik. Although it seems easy, there are many instances where families are not able to say my name. And I do get used to it. And if you have a name that is difficult to pronounce, you do get used to it as well. But it's really nice when somebody is able to say your name properly. And our First Nations, unfortunately, they were marked with the name Indian by the Europeans who arrived and made their first arrival. The Indians' name was given by the Europeans when the Europeans arrived, because the Europeans, Columbus especially, thought that he actually did land just off of the Indian coast, and the people that he saw, he called them Indians, because that was the purpose of his voyage, to find a route to Asia, to India. And Columbus never took the time to say, hey, what is your name? Who are you? How do you say your name? So the Europeans had this very ethnocentric attitude, remember from the last lesson, that the Europeans are the best and everything that they do is better than everything else that anybody else does. So they didn't feel that it was important to find out what the actual name of these people that were being met for the first time, what their name actually is. So you can see some examples here, the names that were changed from the First Nations. So the First Nations, you can see on the left here, we have got the First Nation names here on the left. And then the Europeans either didn't care to learn what the names actually were, how to pronounce them properly. But then on the right-hand side, the Europeans then renamed those groups to something else. And if you are any immigrant or a recent immigrant, or if you know that first person in your family that did come to Canada, if you are of an immigrant family, chances are that your name has changed. I know my name has changed. The government has changed our last name. And this was done at a time when the government thought that they were better than everybody else as well. So that ethnocentrism didn't just apply to Europeans. That happened here to our government when many of our immigrants first came to Canada. And Aboriginal people is a name for Indigenous people of North America and all of their descendants. So our government here in Canada recognizes three groups of Aboriginal people. We've got the First Nations, the Inuit, and the Métis. First Nations first came into use in the 1970s to replace words like band and words like Indian. The First Nations are the original inhabitants of the land along with our Inuit. And we use First Nations, Aboriginal, and Indigenous, we use them interchangeably within our curriculum here in grade 7. So when we mention First Nations, we are speaking of the first people. Okay, the Inuit are several different peoples. They are the original inhabitants of the coastal regions up in the north. So you will find them in our Arctic region as well as in Greenland. And then the last recognized Aboriginal people group from the government is that of the Métis. And we will be learning more of the Métis as the year goes on. But it's a French word that means mixed blood. Métis are descendants of First Nation women and European explorers and fur traders. Later on this year in Chapter 8, we are going to learn a lot more about the Métis. What I'd like you to do now is I want you to head over to your notebook, and there will be an assessment there, an activity for this lesson, as well as you are going to be responsible for reading pages 7 all the way to 13 as a review for this lesson.